Hello, and welcome to an in-depth story about the Roman Empire to help you fall asleep. The year was 133 BCE, and Rome stood at the pinnacle of its power. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, deep currents of change were already beginning to reshape the ancient republic. Picture, if you will, this moment of quiet before the storm. A young nobleman preparing to challenge the very foundations of Roman society, not from ambition, but from a genuine desire to heal the wounds that conquest had inflicted upon the conquerors themselves. The transformation of Roman society in the 2nd century BCE was as dramatic as any military conquest. Picture the streets of Rome, no longer filled with simple farmers and craftsmen, but crowded with merchants from distant lands, slaves from every corner of the Mediterranean, and displaced veterans who had returned from foreign wars to find their old way of life vanishing. The city had grown beyond all recognition, its population swollen by immigration and conquest, its traditional values strained by unprecedented wealth and power. The Roman Forum, once a simple marketplace where local farmers sold their produce, had become the commercial heart of the Mediterranean world. Picture the crowds that gathered there each morning. Syrian merchants offering spices and silks, Greek scholars seeking wealthy patrons, Egyptian grain dealers negotiating contracts that would feed the growing urban population. The babble of languages, Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Punic, Germanic dialects, testified to Rome's transformation into a cosmopolitan empire. The traditional Roman house, simple and functional, began to give way to elaborate mansions that reflected the new wealth flowing into the city. Picture the homes of the great senatorial families, their walls adorned with frescoes depicting scenes from Greek mythology, their courtyards filled with sculptures looted from conquered cities. The atrium, once the heart of family life, became a reception hall where clients gathered each morning to pay their respects to their patrons. The Roman women of this era enjoyed greater freedom and influence than their ancestors had known. Picture the wealthy matrons who patronized Greek philosophers and poets, who commissioned works of art and literature, who played increasingly important roles in the political maneuvering of their husbands and sons. The traditional Roman virtue of pudicitia, modesty and chastity, was being challenged by new ideas about personal freedom and self-expression. The transformation of Roman religion was equally significant. Picture the ancient rituals being performed alongside new ceremonies imported from the East. The worship of Cybele, the Great Mother, with its ecstatic rites and castrated priests, shocked traditional Romans, but attracted many followers. The mystery religions, promising personal salvation and direct communion with the divine, competed with the old state religion for the loyalty of the people. The Roman army, too, was changing. Picture the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world, no longer composed primarily of citizen farmers serving short terms, but increasingly made up of professional soldiers who served for decades. These veterans, landless and rootless, looked to their commanders rather than the state for their security and advancement. The old citizen soldier was giving way to the professional warrior, a change that would have profound consequences for the Roman political system. The slaves who flooded into Rome from the conquered territories transformed the economic life of the city. Picture the great slave markets where human beings were bought and sold like commodities, their skills and origins determining their value. Greek slaves, educated and cultured, became tutors and administrators. Germanic slaves, strong and hardy, worked in the mines and quarries. The economy of Rome increasingly depended on this forced labor, creating a massive underclass that lived in constant fear of revolt. The gladiatorial games, which had begun as funeral rites for fallen warriors, evolved into spectacular entertainments that satisfied the Roman people's appetite for violence and drama. Picture the amphitheatres where these contests were held, their sand-covered floors soaked with blood, their tiers of seats filled with spectators cheering for their favourites. The games became a way for wealthy politicians to win popularity with the masses, and the costs grew ever more extravagant. The Roman educational system expanded to meet the needs of an increasingly complex society. Picture the schools, where young Romans learned not just Latin literature, but Greek philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. The traditional Roman virtues of courage, honesty, and simplicity were supplemented by Greek ideals of intellectual excellence and artistic achievement. The Roman elite became truly cosmopolitan, equally at home, discussing Plato in Athens or Cicero in Rome. The legal system, too, grew more sophisticated as Rome encountered new peoples and situations. Picture the Roman jurists working to develop principles that could govern relations between citizens and foreigners, between different communities within the empire, between masters and slaves. The concept of natural law, principles of justice that applied to all human beings, regardless of their citizenship, began to emerge from these practical necessities. The Roman calendar, originally based on the lunar year, was reformed to accommodate the needs of a Mediterranean empire. Picture the confusion that arose when different parts of the empire celebrated the same festivals on different days, when military campaigns had to be coordinated across vast distances, when commercial contracts had to specify dates that would be understood in different provinces. The solar calendar adopted by Julius Caesar would solve these problems, but the need for reform reflected the growing complexity of Roman life. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and later Gaius, were born into this world of change and opportunity, yet they became champions of the traditional Roman values that seemed to be disappearing. Picture Tiberius as a young man, serving with distinction in the Spanish Wars, witnessing the courage and loyalty of the Roman soldiers who had conquered an empire. But he also saw how these same soldiers returned home to find their farms abandoned and their families scattered. The problem of the veterans was both practical and moral. Picture the Roman farmer soldier who had served for 20 years in foreign wars, leaving his fields to be tended by his wife and children. When he returned, he found his land exhausted, his equipment outdated, his neighbors gone. The small farms that had been the backbone of Roman society were being absorbed into great estates worked by slave labor and owned by wealthy investors who had profited from the wars. The latifundia, great agricultural estates, were more efficient than small farms in producing crops for urban markets. Picture these vast plantations stretching for miles across the Roman countryside, their fields planted with single crops designed for export. The olive groves and vineyards that supplied oil and wine to the cities of the empire, the grain fields that fed the urban populations, the pastures where cattle and sheep grazed under the supervision of slave herdsmen. All of these represented rational economic development, but they also meant the displacement of the traditional Roman peasantry. The owners of these estates were often senators and other wealthy Romans who had invested the profits of conquest in land. Picture them in their villas, surrounded by the luxury that empire had brought, planning the development of their properties with the same strategic thinking that had won Rome its wars. They were not villains, but practical men adapting to new circumstances, yet their success came at the cost of the traditional Roman way of life. The urban masses who had been displaced from the land presented a new challenge for Roman politics. Picture the crowds that gathered in the Forum, no longer composed primarily of landowners who had a stake in the stability of the state, but of propertyless citizens who depended on day labor, public works, and the generosity of politicians for their survival. These men had the right to vote, but lacked the economic independence that had been the foundation of Roman citizenship. The grain supply became a crucial political issue as Rome's urban population grew. Picture the long lines of ships arriving at the port of Ostia, their holds filled with grain from Sicily, Egypt, and North Africa. The safe arrival of these shipments meant the difference between plenty and famine for the city's inhabitants. Politicians who could guarantee the grain supply won the gratitude of the people, while those who failed faced riots and political destruction. The Roman nobility, faced with these new challenges, struggled to maintain their traditional authority. Picture the great senatorial families, their ancestors' death masks displayed in the atria of their homes, their genealogies stretching back to the founders of the Republic. They had governed Rome successfully for centuries, but the problems of empire strained their traditional methods of rule. The informal networks of patronage and influence that had worked in a city-state were less effective in governing a Mediterranean empire. The rise of demagogues, politicians who appealed directly to the people rather than working through traditional channels, threatened the stability of the Roman political system. Picture the popular assemblies where these men addressed the crowds, their speeches filled with promises of land redistribution, debt relief, and free grain. The Senate, accustomed to governing through consensus and compromise, found itself unable to compete with politicians who offered simple solutions to complex problems. The violence that erupted during Tiberius Gracchus's tribunate marked a turning point in Roman history. Picture the confrontation on the Capitoline Hill, where senators and their supporters armed themselves with clubs and stones to attack the tribune and his followers. The blood that flowed that day broke the unwritten rules that had governed Roman politics for centuries, establishing the precedent that force could be used to settle political disputes. The death of Tiberius Gracchus shocked the Roman world, but it did not end the crisis he had tried to address. Picture his younger brother Gaius, taking up the fallen banner of reform 10 years later, his proposals even more radical than those of his predecessor. The grain law that provided subsidized food for the urban poor, the judicial reforms that weakened the power of the Senate, the citizenship proposals that would have extended Roman rights to the Italian allies. All of these measures addressed real problems, but also threatened the traditional balance of power. The fall of Gaius Gracchus was even more dramatic than that of his brother. Picture the final confrontation on the Aventine Hill, where the younger Gracchus and his followers made their last stand against the forces of the consul Opimius. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree that gave the magistrates emergency powers, was used for the first time, establishing another precedent that would be employed repeatedly in the coming decades. The Italian allies who had fought alongside Rome for generations found themselves increasingly marginalized as the empire grew. Picture the Latin communities that had provided soldiers for Roman armies, their young men dying in foreign wars, while their cities received fewer and fewer benefits from Roman victory. The social war that erupted in 91 BCE was the inevitable result of Rome's failure to reward its most faithful supporters. The name social war comes from the Latin word socii, meaning allies, and it reflected the fundamental injustice of a system that demanded sacrifice from people who were denied full participation in the benefits of empire. Picture the Italian warriors who had learned Roman military tactics and discipline, now turning these skills against their former partners. The war was bitter and destructive, fought not against foreign enemies, but against neighbors and kinsmen. The Roman response to the social war was both military and political. Picture the legions marching through the familiar landscapes of central Italy, their commanders facing the difficult task of fighting against men who had served with them in previous campaigns. But Rome also offered political concessions, gradually extending citizenship to communities that laid down their arms and accepted Roman authority. The end of the social war transformed the Roman state from a city-state with an empire into a true nation. Picture the ceremony where the new citizens first exercised their voting rights, their voices joining the chorus of Roman democracy. The extension of citizenship was a practical necessity, but it also represented the triumph of Roman ideals of inclusion and assimilation over narrower concepts of ethnic or tribal identity. The slave revolts that plagued the late Republic reflected the growing tensions within Roman society. Picture the gladiatorial school in Capua, where Spartacus and his fellow fighters planned their escape, their knowledge of Roman military tactics making them formidable opponents. The revolt that began in 73 BCE was not just a bid for freedom, but a challenge to the institution of slavery that had become essential to Roman prosperity. Spartacus himself remains a mysterious figure, but ancient sources describe him as a Thracian warrior who had served in the Roman army before being enslaved. Picture him in the amphitheater, fighting for the entertainment of the crowds, his skill and courage earning him fame, but not freedom. His decision to rebel was not impulsive, but carefully planned, reflecting his understanding of both Roman weaknesses and the desperation of his fellow slaves. The gladiator army that Spartacus led was unlike any force Rome had faced before. Picture the escaped slaves and dispossessed farmers who flocked to his banner, their numbers swelling from dozens to tens of thousands. They were not trained soldiers, but desperate people with nothing to lose, united by their hatred of the system that had oppressed them. Their initial victories shocked the Roman world and inspired similar revolts throughout the empire. The Roman response to the slave revolt was hampered by the political divisions that were tearing the Republic apart. Picture the rival generals who competed for the honor of defeating Spartacus, their personal ambitions interfering with the coordination of military strategy. The revolt dragged on for 2 years, devastating the Italian countryside and threatening the stability of the Roman state. The final defeat of Spartacus and his followers was brutal and decisive. Picture the crucifixion of 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, their bodies serving as a grim reminder of the price of defying Roman authority. The revolt had been crushed, but it had revealed the fragility of a system that depended on the forced labor of people who had every reason to hate their masters. The rise of powerful military commanders in the late Republic reflected the growing importance of professional armies in Roman politics. Picture Marius, the new man who rose from humble origins to become one of Rome's greatest generals, his reforms of the army creating the professional legions that would dominate the Mediterranean world. His rivalry with Sulla, the aristocratic general who championed the traditional privileges of the nobility, foreshadowed the civil wars that would destroy the Republic. The March of Sulla on Rome in 88 BCE was the first time in Roman history that a consul had led an army against his own city. Picture the shock and horror of the Roman people as they watched foreign enemies approach their gates, only to discover that the soldiers were Romans led by a Roman general. The precedent was set. Roman armies would fight Roman armies, and the winner would reshape the state according to his vision. The proscriptions that followed Sulla's victory were a systematic attempt to eliminate his political enemies. Picture the lists of condemned men posted in the Forum, their names spelling death for hundreds of senators, knights, and other prominent citizens. The confiscation of their property provided funds for Sulla's veterans, but it also created a cycle of violence and revenge that would poison Roman politics for generations. Sulla's constitutional reforms were designed to strengthen the Senate and restore the traditional balance of power, but they could not address the fundamental problems that had created the crisis. Picture the dictator in his final years, surrounded by luxury and pleasure, perhaps understanding that his reforms were temporary solutions to permanent problems. His voluntary retirement from power was unprecedented, but it did not restore the stability he had sought to create. The fall asleep to to the entire history of the Roman Empire. Part 1. The Dawn of Rome, 753 BCE, 264 BCE. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to stand on the 7 hills of ancient Rome, feeling the Mediterranean breeze carry the scent of olive groves and cypress trees, while the gentle murmur of the Tiber River flows below? Tonight, we'll embark on a tranquil journey through time, tracing the remarkable story of an empire that began as a small city-state and grew to encompass the known world. From the legendary founding by Romulus and Remus to the conquest of distant lands, we'll explore the lives of emperors and citizens, soldiers and scholars, all who lived and dreamed under the same constellations that shine down upon us tonight. So settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow yourself to drift gently into the past, where the echoes of ancient voices still whisper through the ruins of the eternal city. Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking through the Roman Forum on a warm summer evening in the 1st century CE. The marble columns catch the golden light of the setting sun, their surfaces warm to the touch after a day of Mediterranean sunshine. The air is filled with the gentle sound of fountains and the distant murmur of conversation as citizens make their way home through the ancient streets. This is the world we're about to explore together. A world of triumph and tragedy, of human ambition and divine destiny, of stories that have shaped our understanding of civilization itself. As we begin our journey, feel the weight of history beneath your feet. Every stone in the Roman Forum has witnessed moments of profound significance. The speeches of Cicero, the funeral of Julius Caesar, the triumph of victorious generals returning from distant campaigns. The very air seems to shimmer with the ghosts of the past, inviting us to step back through the centuries and witness the rise and fall of the greatest empire the world has ever known. Let your mind drift now to a time before Rome existed, when the Italian peninsula was home to scattered tribes and small city-states. Picture the landscape as it might have appeared 3,000 years ago: rolling hills covered with oak forests, fertile valleys where small communities practiced agriculture, and coastal plains where fishing villages dotted the shoreline. The Mediterranean world was already ancient, with established civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. But the people who would build Rome were still living in relative simplicity, their greatest adventures still ahead of them. The story of Rome begins not with historical fact, but with legend. And in this twilight hour, legends seem especially appropriate. Let yourself be carried back to the mythical age when gods walked among mortals and heroes performed deeds that would echo through eternity. In this dreamlike realm of ancient storytelling, we encounter the tale of Aeneas, the Trojan prince who fled the burning city of Troy and, after many adventures, arrived in Italy to found a new civilization. Picture Aeneas standing on the deck of his ship as it approaches the Italian coast, the salt spray misting his face as he looks toward the land that will become his new home. Behind him lies the destruction of Troy, the city of his birth, reduced to ash and rubble by the Greek armies. Ahead lies uncertainty, but also destiny, for the gods have promised him that his descendants will build a city that will rule the world. The scene is both melancholy and hopeful, a perfect metaphor for the human condition and the way that endings often become beginnings. The marriage of Aeneas to Lavinia, daughter of the Italian king Latinus, represents the union of East and West, of the sophisticated culture of the Greek world with the hardy virtues of the Italian tribes. From this union would spring the royal line that would eventually produce Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. The story reminds us that civilizations are not born in isolation, but emerge from the meeting and mixing of different peoples and cultures. As the generations pass in the realm of legend, we come to the story of Rhea Silvia, the Vestal Virgin who was loved by Mars, the god of war, and gave birth to the twins Romulus and Remus. Picture her terror and wonder as she realizes that she carries the children of a god, knowing that her sacred vows should have protected her from such a fate. The birth of the twins represents the moment when the divine enters human history, when the gods themselves become invested in the fate of a small Italian city. The image of the she-wolf nursing the abandoned twins has become one of the most powerful symbols in Western culture, representing the wild origins of civilization and the way that nature itself can nurture human greatness. Imagine the scene in the wilderness, along the Tiber, the great wolf, fierce and protective, providing milk and warmth to the helpless infants who would grow up to found the greatest city in the world. There's something deeply moving about this image, suggesting that even the most sophisticated civilizations retain something wild and untamed at their core. The shepherd Faustulus, who discovers the twins and raises them as his own, represents the humble human element in this divine drama. Picture him as a simple, honest man, weathered by years of outdoor life, who recognizes something special in these foundling children. His decision to raise them as his own speaks to the Roman virtue of pietas, the sense of duty and responsibility that binds families and communities together. As Romulus and Remus grow to manhood, they learn their true identity and decide to found a city of their own. The quarrel that leads to Remus's death, whether by Romulus's hand or by that of his followers, introduces the theme of fraternal conflict that will haunt Roman history. Picture the moment when Romulus realizes what he has done, standing over his brother's body with the knowledge that his city will be built on bloodshed. It's a sobering reminder that even the greatest achievements often come at a terrible cost. The actual founding of Rome, traditionally dated to April 21st, 753 BCE, is depicted as a religious ceremony. Picture Romulus as he harnesses a white bull and a white cow to his plough and traces the sacred boundary of his new city. The furrow he creates becomes the pomerium, the sacred boundary that separates the city from the countryside, the civilized from the wild. When he lifts the plough at the spots where gates will be built, he creates the openings through which the life of the city will flow. The early population of Rome, according to legend, consisted largely of refugees, outcasts, and adventurers who had fled from other cities. Picture them gathering on the Palatine Hill, a motley collection of humanity, united only by their willingness to take a chance on Romulus's vision. The city becomes a place of new beginnings, where a person's past matters less than their willingness to contribute to the common good. The famous story of the rape of the Sabine women, while troubling to modern sensibilities, was intended to explain how the early Romans acquired wives and established peaceful relations with their neighbors. Picture the festival that Romulus organized, ostensibly to honor the gods, but actually to provide an opportunity for his followers to seize wives from the visiting Sabine families. The story suggests that Rome's expansion was accomplished not just through conquest, but through intermarriage and cultural fusion. The intervention of the Sabine women, who throw themselves between their Roman husbands and their Sabine fathers and brothers to prevent further bloodshed, represents the peacemaking power of family bonds. Picture these women, some carrying infants born of their Roman marriages, as they plead for reconciliation between the two peoples. Their success in ending the conflict suggests that Rome's future lay not in domination, but in integration, not in destruction, but in assimilation. Long before the great monuments and marble temples, before the legions marched across 3 continents, there was only a collection of small hilltop settlements along the banks of the Tiber River. Picture, if you will, the soft golden light of dawn breaking over these 7 hills in the year 753 BCE. The morning mist rises slowly from the river, and in this peaceful landscape, shepherds tend their flocks, while farmers work the rich volcanic soil that will one day support 1 million souls. The 7 hills of Rome, the Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian, each had its own character and significance in the early city. Picture the Palatine Hill, where archaeological evidence suggests the earliest settlements were established. The slope faces south, catching the warming rays of the winter sun, while a natural spring provides fresh water for the inhabitants. The location is perfect for a small farming community, defensible, well-watered, and blessed with fertile soil. The Capitoline Hill, though smaller than the others, would become the religious heart of Rome. Picture it in these early days, crowned with a simple shrine to Jupiter, the sky god who hurls thunderbolts and commands the weather. The hill's 2 peaks, one dedicated to Jupiter, the other to Juno, his wife, rise above the surrounding landscape like natural temples, their rocky outcrops providing a dramatic setting for religious ceremonies. The Aventine Hill, across the valley from the Palatine, would later become associated with the plebeians, the common people of Rome. Picture its slopes in the early days, dotted with small farms and workshops where craftsmen practiced their trades. The hill's location outside the original sacred boundary of the city made it a natural place for foreign merchants and immigrants to settle, giving it a cosmopolitan character that would persist throughout Roman history. As you breathe deeply and let your mind wander to this ancient landscape, imagine the daily rhythms of life in these early settlements. The Romans were farmers above all else, and their calendar was structured around the agricultural year. Spring was the time for planting, when families would gather to bless the seeds and pray for a good harvest. The festivals of this season, the Robigalia to ward off crop diseases, the Floralia to encourage flowering, connected the people to the natural world that sustained them. Summer brought the hard work of tending the growing crops, weeding and watering under the intense Mediterranean sun. Picture the Roman farmer, bronze-skinned and weathered by outdoor labor, as he checks his fields in the early morning before the heat becomes unbearable. His wife and children help with the lighter tasks, while slaves, if the family is prosperous enough to own them, handle the heaviest work. The autumn harvest was a time of thanksgiving and community celebration. Picture the threshing floors where grain was separated from chaff, the wine presses where grapes were crushed, the olive groves where families gathered to collect the precious fruit that would provide oil for cooking and lighting. The harvest festivals, the Vinalia for wine, the Consualia for stored grain, combined practical celebrations of abundance with religious thanksgiving to the gods who had provided it. Winter was the quiet season, when farmers mended their tools and planned for the coming year. Picture the Roman family gathered around their hearth as the rain drummed on the roof and the wind whistled through the shutters. This was the time for storytelling, when the old tales were passed down to the young, when the history and traditions of the community were preserved in memory and song. The early Roman house was a simple affair, built around a central courtyard called an atrium. Picture the family gathering in this space, which was open to the sky and caught rainwater in a central pool. The rooms of the house opened onto the atrium, providing light and air while maintaining privacy from the street. The hearth, where the family's sacred fire was kept burning, was the spiritual center of the home, tended by the women of the household and honored by all. The Roman family was a hierarchical institution, with the paterfamilias, the male head of household, wielding absolute authority over his wife, children, and slaves. Picture him conducting the morning prayers, offering wine and incense to the household gods who protected the family. His authority was both practical and religious, for he served as the priest of the family cult and the guardian of its traditions. Roman women, though subject to male authority, played crucial roles in family life and religious observance. Picture the Roman matron teaching her daughters to spin and weave, skills that were considered essential for every woman, regardless of social class. Even wealthy women were expected to know how to work wool, and the finest garments were those made by the lady of the house herself. The education of Roman children began early and emphasized practical skills along with moral instruction. Picture young boys learning to read and write using wax tablets, practicing their letters while their tutors told stories of Roman heroes and their noble deeds. The tales of Horatius defending the bridge, of Cincinnatus leaving his plough to serve as dictator, of Brutus sacrificing his sons for the good of the Republic. These stories formed the moral backbone of Roman education. Girls received education too, though it was more limited and focused on domestic skills. Picture a young Roman girl learning to manage a household, to supervise servants, to calculate expenses and plan meals. But she might also learn to read and write, to appreciate poetry and music, to understand the basics of law and politics that would help her advise her husband and raise her children. The religious life of early Rome was centered on the worship of numerous gods and goddesses, each with their specific areas of responsibility. Picture the small shrines that dotted the city, each dedicated to a particular deity. Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was honored in every home. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings, watched over doorways and transitions. The Penates protected the household stores, while the Lares guarded the family property. The public religion of Rome was equally complex, with different gods responsible for different aspects of community life. Picture the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, where the most important state ceremonies were conducted. The god's statue, carved from ivory and gold, presided over the city with benevolent authority, while his priests, chosen from the highest ranks of society, performed the rituals that maintained the peace between gods and mortals. The Roman calendar was filled with religious festivals, each marking an important moment in the agricultural or civic year. Picture the Saturnalia in December, when social roles were temporarily reversed and masters waited on their slaves. The Lupercalia in February, when young men ran through the streets striking bystanders with leather thongs to ensure fertility. The Perilia in April, when shepherds drove their flocks through fires to purify them for the coming year. These festivals were not mere entertainment, but essential elements of Roman civic life. They reinforced social bonds, honored the gods, and provided opportunities for the community to gather and reaffirm its shared values. Picture the entire population of early Rome, perhaps only a few thousand souls, gathering in the Forum for a major festival, their voices raised in hymns that echoed off the surrounding hills. The early Roman government was a mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy that would evolve over time into the complex system of the Republic. Picture the king, chosen by the people and confirmed by the gods, as he holds court in the simple palace on the Palatine Hill. His authority is both practical and sacred, for he serves as the supreme commander of the army, the chief judge of legal disputes, and the high priest of the state religion. But the king does not rule alone. Picture the Senate, composed of the heads of the leading families, as they advise the monarch on matters of policy and tradition. These senators, the word comes from senex, meaning old man, represent the accumulated wisdom of the community, their authority based on age, experience, and the respect of their peers. The people too have their voice in government, for certain decisions require their approval. Picture the citizens gathering in the Comitium, the traditional meeting place near the Forum, to hear speeches and cast their votes. The system is simple compared to what it will become, but it establishes the principle that political authority ultimately derives from the consent of the governed. As Rome grew from a small city-state to a regional power, its government evolved to meet new challenges. Picture the moment when the Romans decided to expel their last king and establish a republic. The decision was not made lightly, for monarchy had served Rome well for over 2 centuries. But the abuses of Tarquin the Proud had convinced the people that no single person should wield absolute power over the state. The establishment of the Republic in 509 BCE marked a turning point in Roman history. Picture the first consuls, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, as they take the oath of office in the Forum. They swear to defend the liberty of the Roman people and to prevent any individual from establishing a tyranny. The office of consul, with its dual leadership and annual terms, embodies the Roman determination to prevent the concentration of power in any single hands. The early republic faced immediate challenges from both internal and external enemies. Picture the surviving supporters of the monarchy as they plot to restore the old order, their conspiracies discovered and punished by the new government. The external threats were even more serious, as neighboring peoples tested the resolve of the new Roman state. The Etruscans, Rome's sophisticated neighbors to the north, had long exercised influence over the developing city. Picture their armies advancing on Rome, led by Lars Porsena, the king of Clusium, who sought to restore the exiled Tarquin to power. The Romans, committed to their new republican government, prepared to defend their liberty against overwhelming odds. The story of Horatius Cocles, defending the Sublician Bridge, has become one of the most famous tales in Roman literature. Picture the young warrior standing alone against the entire Etruscan army, while his comrades destroy the bridge behind him. His courage and sacrifice, whether historical or legendary, embody the Roman ideal of devotion to duty and willingness to die for the common good. The legend of Mucius Scaevola, who thrust his right hand into a fire to demonstrate Roman determination, further illustrates the character that the Romans attributed to their ancestors. Picture the young man standing before the Etruscan king, his hand burning in the flames, while he declares that 500 Romans have sworn to kill their enemies or die in the attempt. The story may be myth, but it expresses the Roman conviction that moral courage is more powerful than physical force. These early conflicts with the Etruscans and other neighboring peoples established patterns that would characterize Roman expansion for centuries. The Romans learned to combine military prowess with diplomatic skill, offering generous terms to defeated enemies who agreed to become allies. Picture the Roman embassy arriving at a conquered city, offering its people the choice between destruction and incorporation into the Roman system. The integration of defeated peoples into the Roman state was one of the keys to Roman success. Unlike many ancient empires that simply exploited their subjects, Rome offered a path to full citizenship for those who proved their loyalty and worth. Picture the Latin allies who fought alongside Roman legions, their young men earning honor and advancement through military service, their communities gradually adopting Roman customs and law. The Roman road system, which would eventually connect every corner of the empire, began during this period of early expansion. Picture the Roman engineers surveying the landscape, planning routes that would serve both military and commercial purposes. The roads were built to last, with deep foundations and carefully fitted stone surfaces that could bear the weight of armies and merchant caravans for centuries. These roads were more than mere transportation routes. They were symbols of Roman permanence and authority. Picture the milestones that marked distances, their inscriptions proclaiming the achievements of the magistrates who built them. The roads carried not just goods and armies, but ideas and customs, spreading Roman civilization throughout the Italian peninsula. Legend tells us that on this very land, twin brothers named Romulus and Remus were found as infants, abandoned by the riverbank and nursed by a she-wolf. Imagine the gentle creature discovering these helpless children, her maternal instincts awakening as she provides them with the warmth and nourishment they need to survive. The story, whether true or mythical, speaks to something profound about the Roman character, a people who would see themselves as both civilized and wild, both nurturing and fierce. As you breathe deeply and let your mind wander, envision young Romulus as he grows into manhood. He stands on the Palatine Hill, looking out over the countryside with the vision of a founder. The wind carries the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of shepherds' pipes. Here, he decides to build a city, marking out its boundaries with a simple plough drawn by a white bull and a white cow. The furrow he creates becomes sacred, the first border of what will become the greatest empire the world has ever known. But Rome's early days were not grand or glorious. Picture small huts with thatched roofs, clustered together for protection. Families gathered around simple hearths as evening fell, sharing stories and passing down traditions from generation to generation. Women spun wool by oil lamps, while men sharpened their farming tools and weapons. Children played with wooden toys and learned the skills they would need to survive in a world where neighboring tribes might attack without warning. The early Romans were not yet the sophisticated urbanites we imagine. They were farmers and herders, craftsmen and traders, living close to the earth and the cycles of nature. Feel the rhythm of their daily lives, rising with the sun, working the fields, tending animals, gathering for simple meals of bread, cheese, and wine. The pace was slow, measured by the seasons and the needs of survival rather than the ambitions of empire. As the decades passed, Rome grew from a collection of villages into a proper city. The Romans learned from their neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, with their sophisticated art and engineering, and the Greeks to the south, with their philosophy and literature. Imagine Roman merchants traveling to Etruscan cities, their eyes wide with wonder at the painted tombs and elaborate temples. They return home with new ideas about architecture, about governance, about the possibilities of urban life. The early Roman government was a monarchy, ruled by kings who served as both political leaders and religious figures. Picture King Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, walking slowly through the sacred groves outside the city. He pauses to observe the flight of birds, interpreting their patterns as messages from the gods. Under his peaceful reign, Rome established many of its religious traditions and legal customs. The city grew more prosperous, and the Romans began to see themselves as chosen by the gods for greatness. But monarchy would not last. By 509 BCE, the Romans had grown weary of royal rule and established a republic. Imagine the excitement and uncertainty of that moment when the last king was expelled and the Romans decided to govern themselves. Citizens gathered in the forum, their voices echoing off the surrounding hills as they debated the future of their city. The concept of the republic, res publica or public thing, represented a radical new idea that power should belong to the people rather than to a single ruler. The new Roman Republic was led by 2 consuls, elected annually, who shared power and checked each other's authority. Picture these early consuls, dressed in simple togas, walking through the streets of Rome with dignity, but without the pomp of kings. They were citizens among citizens, temporarily elevated to leadership, but always accountable to the people who had chosen them. As Rome's population grew and its territory expanded, the Romans faced constant challenges from neighboring peoples. The Etruscans, Samnites, and various Italian tribes all contested Roman expansion. Imagine the young Roman soldiers, many of them farmers called from their fields, as they prepared for battle. They gathered at dawn in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, their bronze armor gleaming in the early morning light. The clatter of weapons and the nervous laughter of men facing danger filled the air as they formed their ranks. Roman warfare in these early centuries was brutal but personal. Picture the phalanx formations, shields locked together, spears bristling forward like the quills of a great porcupine. The men breathed heavily behind their bronze helmets, sweat mixing with dust as they advanced toward the enemy. Victory meant survival and expansion. Defeat meant death or slavery. Yet even in warfare, the Romans showed their practical nature, often offering generous terms to defeated enemies who agreed to become allies. The conquest of Italy was a gradual process, taking nearly 3 centuries to complete. Imagine the slow expansion of Roman control, like ripples spreading across a pond. Each victory brought new lands, new peoples, and new challenges. The Romans developed a genius for administration, creating a system of alliances and colonies that allowed them to control vast territories without enormous garrisons. As you drift deeper into relaxation, picture the Roman colonies being established throughout Italy. Roman families, seeking new opportunities, packed their belongings onto ox-drawn carts and set out for distant lands. They brought with them Roman laws, Roman customs, and Roman gods, planting seeds of civilization in previously wild territories. The colonists built forums and temples, aqueducts and roads, creating miniature versions of Rome itself. The Roman road system began during this period, connecting the growing empire with stone pathways that would endure for millennia. Imagine the Roman engineers working with simple tools but sophisticated knowledge as they surveyed the landscape and planned their routes. They built their roads straight and true, with deep foundations and carefully fitted stones. The steady ring of hammers on stone and the shouted instructions of foremen created a rhythm that spoke of permanence and purpose. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. Picture the city itself, now grown far beyond its original boundaries on the 7 hills. The population had swelled to perhaps 100,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world. The Forum Romanum bustled with activity as merchants, politicians, and ordinary citizens conducted their daily business. The scent of fresh bread from the bakeries mixed with the aroma of incense from the temples, creating the distinctive atmosphere of urban life. The Roman people of this era were proud, but not yet arrogant, successful, but not yet supreme. They understood that their expansion had brought them to the edge of a larger world, where great powers like Carthage and the Hellenistic kingdoms held sway. The Romans looked out beyond Italy with a mixture of ambition and apprehension, knowing that their next wars would determine whether Rome would become a regional power or something far greater. As this first phase of Roman history draws to a close, imagine the Roman senators gathering in the Curia, their white togas bright against the shadows of the building. They debate the great question of their time. Should Rome challenge Carthage for control of the Mediterranean? The decision they make will launch Rome into a series of conflicts that will test the very survival of the Republic and ultimately transform it into the master of the known world. Feel the weight of this moment as generations of Roman dreams and struggles culminate in a choice that will echo through the centuries. The Romans who built their city from humble beginnings on the Tiber's banks could never have imagined that their descendants would one day rule from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Yet the seeds of empire were already present in their character, their discipline, their adaptability, their willingness to learn from others, and their unshakable belief that Rome was destined for greatness. Let your breathing deepen as you contemplate this ancient world, where the foundations of Western civilization were being laid stone by stone, law by law, generation by generation. The early Romans sleep peacefully in their graves, but their legacy lives on in the roads they built, the laws they wrote, and the ideals they cherished. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you join them in that timeless rest, while the story of their empire continues to unfold. Part 2. The Republic's Rise and the Punic Wars, 264 BCE, 133 BCE. As the gentle morning light filtered through the olive groves of ancient Sicily, Roman soldiers prepared for what would become one of history's most decisive conflicts. The year was 264 BCE, and Rome stood at the threshold of its greatest test. Picture, if you will, the calm before the storm. Roman generals consulting their maps by candlelight, their fingers tracing the coastlines of an island that would soon become the first battlefield in a struggle spanning over a century. The First Punic War began almost by accident, as conflicts often do. Imagine the Roman senators debating whether to cross the narrow strait between Italy and Sicily, that fateful body of water that separated the familiar from the unknown. For the first time in their history, Romans would fight not for the control of Italian hills and valleys, but for supremacy over the wine-dark Mediterranean Sea itself. The Carthaginians were unlike any enemy Rome had faced before. Picture their great city on the North African coast, its harbours filled with sleek warships and merchant vessels heavy with goods from across the known world. Carthage was ancient when Rome was young, a maritime empire built on trade and naval power. Their ships had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, exploring the African coast and establishing trading posts from Spain to Egypt. The Carthaginians were wealthy, cosmopolitan, and utterly confident in their mastery of the sea. But Rome had something Carthage lacked: the stubborn determination of a people who had never accepted defeat. Imagine the Roman decision to build a navy, despite having no tradition of seafaring. Picture Roman shipwrights studying captured Carthaginian vessels, learning their secrets board by board, nail by nail. The Romans practiced rowing on wooden benches set up on land, their movements synchronized by the steady beat of a drum, preparing for battles they could barely imagine. The war dragged on for 23 years, a generation of conflict that tested both empires to their limits. Envision the great naval battles, with hundreds of ships ramming and boarding each other under the Mediterranean sun. The clash of bronze and the cry of men fighting for their lives echoed across waters that had known only peaceful merchant traffic. Roman soldiers, better suited to fighting on solid ground, learned to adapt to the rolling deck of a warship, their sea legs growing stronger with each engagement. The Romans suffered terrible losses, entire fleets destroyed by storms and enemy action. Yet they rebuilt, again and again, with a persistence that amazed their enemies. Picture the forests of Italy being cleared to provide timber for new ships, the foundries working day and night to forge weapons and armor. Roman mothers said goodbye to sons who might never return, while fathers taught younger boys the skills they would need if the war continued. Finally, in 241 BCE, Roman persistence paid off. The Carthaginian fleet was destroyed at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, and Carthage sued for peace. Imagine the celebration in Rome as news of victory arrived. Citizens poured into the streets, their voices raised in songs of triumph. Wine flowed freely, and sacrifices were made to the gods who had granted Rome this hard-won victory. Sicily became Rome's first province, the beginning of an empire that would eventually span 3 continents. But peace with Carthage was destined to be temporary. As you let your mind drift, picture the young Carthaginian boy named Hannibal standing beside his father Hamilcar at an altar in Spain. the father makes his son swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome, planting seeds of conflict that would bloom into the most dangerous war Rome had ever faced. This moment, quiet and private, would echo through history like thunder across the mountains. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE when Hannibal, now a brilliant general, launched his audacious invasion of Italy. Picture the moment when Roman scouts brought news that defied belief. Hannibal was crossing the Alps in winter, bringing war elephants through mountain passes that seemed impossible to traverse. The Romans, secure in their belief that the Alps were an impenetrable barrier, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who had done the impossible. Imagine Hannibal's army struggling through the mountain passes, men and animals suffering in the bitter cold. The war elephants, magnificent creatures from the forests of Africa, trumpeted their distress as they navigated narrow ledges with 1,000-foot drops. Many died in the crossing, but those who survived emerged into the Po Valley like visitors from another world, striking terror into the hearts of Rome's northern allies. For 15 years, Hannibal ravaged the Italian countryside, winning battle after battle against Roman armies. Picture the aftermath of Cannae, Hannibal's greatest victory, where 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on a single field. The Roman general Varro, one of the few survivors, rode back to Rome with news that must have felt like the end of the world. Yet when he arrived, expecting punishment or exile, the Senate thanked him for not despairing of the Republic, a moment that captured the essence of Roman character. Rome's response to these disasters was characteristic of their people. Rather than seek peace, they adopted a strategy of patience and perseverance. Imagine Fabius Maximus, the dictator known as the Delayer, watching Hannibal's army from a distance, never offering battle, but never allowing the enemy to rest. The Romans learned to avoid open battle while slowly wearing down their invaders, cutting supply lines, and recapturing allied cities one by one. The Roman people endured privations that would have broken other nations. Picture Roman matrons donating their jewelry to pay for new armies. Their golden bracelets and silver mirrors melted down to fund the war effort. Farmers abandoned their fields to serve in the legions, leaving their families to tend the crops and pray for their return. The city of Rome itself became a fortress, its walls strengthened and its gates guarded day and night. The tide began to turn when young Scipio Africanus took command of Roman forces in Spain. Unlike the cautious generals who had failed against Hannibal, Scipio was bold and innovative. Picture him studying maps by lamplight, planning the campaign that would cut Hannibal off from reinforcements and support. Scipio understood that to defeat Hannibal, Rome must attack Carthage itself, forcing the great general to return home to defend his native city. The final confrontation came at Zama in 202 BCE, where Hannibal and Scipio faced each other on the plains of North Africa. Imagine the tension before the battle, two legendary generals sizing each other up across the dusty battlefield. Hannibal, aging but still formidable, commanded an army of mercenaries and African conscripts. Scipio led seasoned Roman legions, veterans of countless battles who had learned to fight with the discipline and flexibility that characterized Roman warfare at its best. The battle was decided by Roman cavalry and African allies who had changed sides, surrounding Hannibal's forces and inflicting a decisive defeat. Picture the great Carthaginian general accepting his first major defeat with the dignity that had marked his entire career. As the sun set over the battlefield, the Second Punic War came to an end, leaving Rome as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. But victory came at a terrible price. Picture the Italian countryside, ravaged by 15 years of warfare. Farms lay abandoned, their owners dead or displaced. Cities that had supported Hannibal faced Roman retribution, their populations sold into slavery, or their territories confiscated. The war had transformed Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire, but it had also begun the process that would eventually transform the Republic into something else entirely. The aftermath of the Punic Wars saw Rome's expansion accelerate dramatically. Picture Roman armies marching eastward into Greece and Asia Minor, their eagles casting shadows over lands that had known the glory of Alexander the Great. The Romans, once considered barbarians by the sophisticated Greeks, now came as conquerors, bringing their own form of civilization to the birthplace of philosophy and democracy. The conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean was swift but complex. Unlike the brutal warfare against Carthage, Rome's Eastern wars were often decided by politics and diplomacy as much as by battle. Picture Roman senators negotiating with Hellenistic kings, their practical Latin minds trying to understand the subtle complexities of Eastern politics. The Romans were learning to rule not just Italian farmers and soldiers, but sophisticated urban populations with their own ancient traditions and customs. As Roman power expanded, Roman society began to change. Picture the transformation of the simple farming communities that had once dominated the Italian peninsula. Wealth flowed into Rome from conquered territories, creating a new class of wealthy citizens who lived in luxury previously unknown. Slaves captured in foreign wars worked vast estates, producing grain and other goods for the urban markets that were growing throughout the empire. The old Roman virtues, simplicity, frugality, devotion to the state, began to compete with new influences from the Greek world. Picture Roman aristocrats studying Greek philosophy and rhetoric, their sons learning to speak and write in the language of Homer and Plato. Greek tutors became fashionable, and Greek art began to appear in Roman homes, creating a cultural fusion that would define Roman civilization for centuries to come. Yet this cultural transformation created tensions within Roman society. Picture the elder Cato standing in the Senate House and denouncing the corrupting influence of Greek luxury. He spoke for many Romans who feared that their traditional values were being undermined by foreign influences. The tension between tradition and innovation, between Roman gravitas and Greek sophistication, would become a defining characteristic of Roman culture. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, was less a war than an execution. Picture the Roman army surrounding Carthage, the great city that had once challenged Rome for supremacy, now reduced to a desperate last stand. The Romans, perhaps remembering the terror that Hannibal had brought to Italy, showed no mercy. When the city finally fell in 146 BCE, it was utterly destroyed, its population killed or enslaved, its very stones scattered, and its soil sown with salt. As you drift toward sleep, picture the Roman general standing in the ruins of Carthage, contemplating the destruction his army had wrought. Some sources tell us that Scipio Aemilianus wept as he watched the city burn, perhaps understanding that Rome's complete victory had come at the cost of something precious in the human spirit. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of an era, the final elimination of any power that could challenge Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. By 133 BCE, Rome ruled an empire that stretched from Spain to Asia Minor, from the North Sea to the Sahara Desert. Picture the Roman citizen of this era, living in a world transformed beyond recognition from the simple agricultural society of their ancestors. Roman merchants traded in goods from across the known world. Roman soldiers served in lands their grandfathers had never heard of, and Roman law governed peoples who spoke dozens of different languages. Yet success brought new challenges. Picture the Roman farmer returning from years of military service to find his fields overgrown and his family scattered. Many veterans sold their land to wealthy investors and moved to the cities, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. The wealth of empire flowed to the few, while the many struggled to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The Roman Republic, born from the desire to prevent any single person from wielding absolute power, now faced the challenge of governing an empire that dwarfed anything the founders had imagined. Picture the Roman senators, many of them descendants of the farmers and soldiers who had built the Republic, trying to adapt their simple governmental system to the complex realities of imperial administration. As this chapter of Roman history draws to a close, we see the seeds of future conflicts already being planted. The wealth and power that came with empire would soon create pressures that the republican system could not contain. The stage was being set for the great civil wars that would eventually transform Rome from a republic into the empire that would dominate the Western world for centuries to come. Let your breathing slow as you contemplate this pivotal moment in history, when Rome stood triumphant but uncertain, master of the known world, but still learning what that mastery would cost. The Romans of this era sleep peacefully in their tombs, but their legacy lives on in the institutions they built, the laws they wrote, and the example they set for all who would follow. Tonight, as you join them in rest, their story continues to unfold in the gentle rhythm of your dreams. Part 3. Crisis and Transformation. 133 BCE, 31 BCE. The morning mist clung to the Roman Forum as Tiberius Gracchus walked slowly toward the temple steps, his mind heavy with the weight of revolutionary ideas. The year was 133 BCE, and Rome stood at the pinnacle of its power, yet beneath the surface of triumph, deep currents of change were already beginning to reshape the ancient republic. Picture, if you will, this moment of quiet before the storm, a young nobleman preparing to challenge the very foundations of Roman society, not from ambition, but from a genuine desire to heal the wounds that conquest had inflicted upon the conquerors themselves. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and later Gaius, were born into the highest ranks of Roman society, yet they became champions of the common people. Imagine Tiberius as he traveled through the countryside around Rome, witnessing firsthand the transformation that empire had wrought. Where once small farmers had tilled their own fields, vast estates now stretched to the horizon, worked by gangs of foreign slaves. The citizen soldiers who had won Rome's wars found themselves displaced by the very wealth their victories had created. Picture the Roman countryside in this era of change. The old homesteads stood empty, their thatched roofs collapsing and their fields reverting to wilderness. In their place rose the great latifundia, agricultural factories that produced grain and olive oil for urban markets. The slaves who worked these estates came from across the Mediterranean, Gauls from the northern forests, Greeks from the eastern cities, Africans from beyond the Sahara. They labored under the watchful eyes of overseers, while their former masters, now wealthy landowners, lived in luxurious villas or townhouses in Rome. The crisis came to a head when Tiberius Gracchus proposed radical land reforms. Picture the tension in the Senate House as he outlined his plans to redistribute public land to landless citizens. The senators, many of them beneficiaries of the current system, listened with growing alarm. They saw in Tiberius's proposals not justice, but revolution, not reform, but the destruction of the natural order that had made Rome great. The confrontation between Tiberius and the Senate marked the beginning of a century of civil strife that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic. Imagine the day when Tiberius and his followers were killed on the Capitoline Hill, their blood staining the steps of the temple dedicated to Jupiter, the king of the gods. The violence that erupted that day shattered the unwritten rules that had governed Roman politics for centuries, opening the door to a new era where force would increasingly replace persuasion. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus took up his brother's cause, but with even more radical proposals. Picture him addressing the assembled citizens in the forum, his voice carrying across the crowded space as he promised grain subsidies for the urban poor and citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. The crowd roared its approval, but in the Senate House, the old families watched with growing concern as the traditional order continued to crumble. The fate of Gaius Gracchus was even more tragic than that of his brother. Picture the final confrontation on the Aventine Hill, where Gaius and his followers made their last stand against the forces of the Senate. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, the younger Gracchus chose death over surrender, another casualty in the growing conflict between the old aristocracy and the new realities of imperial Rome. The social war that followed in 91 BCE was a conflict that struck at the heart of Roman identity. Picture the Italian allies who had fought alongside Rome for generations, now taking up arms against their former partners. These were not foreign enemies, but neighbors and kinsmen, people who spoke Latin and worshipped Roman gods, but who had been denied the full rights of citizenship. The war that followed was brutal and bitter, fought not on distant battlefields, but in the familiar landscapes of central Italy. As you let your mind drift, imagine the Roman soldier facing his Italian counterpart across a battlefield in the Apennine Mountains. They might have served together in campaigns against foreign enemies, shared meals around countless campfires, and saved each other's lives in distant lands. Now, they stood ready to kill each other over questions of law and citizenship that seemed almost abstract compared to the very real blood that would be spilled. The social war ended with Roman victory, but it was a victory that acknowledged the justice of the Italian cause. Picture the moment when citizenship was finally granted to Rome's Italian allies, transforming the Roman state from a city-state with an empire into a true nation. The decision was practical as much as generous. Rome needed the manpower and loyalty of its Italian allies to face the growing challenges of governing a Mediterranean empire. But the greatest challenge to Roman stability came from an unexpected source: the rebellion of Spartacus and his fellow gladiators. Picture the amphitheater in Capua, where this Thracian warrior, trained to fight and die for the entertainment of Roman crowds, made the decision that would shake the foundations of Roman society. The revolt that began in 73 BCE was more than a simple slave rebellion. It was a challenge to the very institution of slavery upon which Roman prosperity was built. Imagine Spartacus as he led his growing army of escaped slaves and dispossessed farmers across the Italian countryside. This was not the typical slave revolt of desperate men seeking only to escape their chains. Spartacus and his followers defeated Roman armies, captured entire cities, and for a brief moment seemed capable of overthrowing the established order entirely. Picture the fear in Roman hearts as news arrived of yet another victory by the gladiator army, and the slaves in Roman households began to whisper of freedom. The rebellion lasted 2 years before it was finally crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Picture the final battle, where Spartacus died fighting with the courage that had made him a legend. The surviving rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies serving as a grim reminder of the price of defying Rome. Yet the rebellion had revealed the fragility of a system that depended on the labor of millions of enslaved people who had every reason to hate their masters. Into this world of crisis and transformation stepped three men who would dominate the final decades of the Roman Republic: Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Picture them as young men, ambitious and brilliant, each seeking to restore order to a republic that seemed to be tearing itself apart. They formed the First Triumvirate, a private agreement to share power and influence that marked another step away from the traditional methods of Roman governance. Pompey the Great was the most celebrated general of his generation, a man who had earned his nickname through victories in Spain, Africa, and the East. Picture him in his moment of triumph, standing before the Senate to report on his eastern campaigns. He had defeated Mithridates, the last great enemy of Rome in the East, and had reorganized the entire region into Roman provinces. His achievements were so great that some compared him to Alexander the Great. Yet like Alexander, he would discover that political success was more elusive than military victory. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, a financier and property developer who had built his fortune from the chaos of civil war. Picture him in his luxurious villa, surrounded by works of art looted from across the Mediterranean, planning his next business venture or political maneuver. He craved the military glory that had elevated Pompey and Caesar, but his ambition would ultimately lead him to disaster in the deserts of Mesopotamia. And then there was Julius Caesar, perhaps the most complex and fascinating figure in Roman history. Picture him as a young man, tall and thin, with the pale complexion of the Roman aristocracy. He was known for his eloquence, his charm, and his scandalous lifestyle. But few could have predicted that he would become one of history's greatest conquerors and, ultimately, the destroyer of the Roman Republic. Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE was one of the most remarkable military achievements in ancient history. Picture the Roman legions crossing the Rhine for the first time, entering the dark forests of Germania, where no Roman had ever ventured. Imagine the Gallic warriors, tall and fierce, their long hair bleached with lime and their bodies painted with blue woad, facing the disciplined ranks of Roman soldiers in battles that would determine the fate of Western Europe. The siege of Alesia in 52 BCE was perhaps Caesar's greatest military achievement. Picture the hilltop fortress, where Vercingetorix, the young Gallic chieftain, made his last stand against Roman rule. Caesar's army built a double wall around the city, besieging the besiegers while fighting off relief forces from the surrounding countryside. The engineering skill and tactical brilliance displayed in this campaign would become legendary, studied by military leaders for centuries to come. But Caesar's victories in Gaul created a new problem for the Roman Republic. Picture the Senate House, where nervous senators debated what to do about their increasingly powerful general. Caesar commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions, controlled vast wealth from his conquests, and had built a reputation that rivaled the greatest heroes of Roman history. The very success that had made him valuable to Rome now made him dangerous to the traditional order. The crisis came to a head in 49 BCE when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary between his province of Gaul and Italy proper. Picture that moment of decision as Caesar stood on the riverbank with his troops, knowing that to cross meant civil war, but to retreat meant political destruction. His famous words, "The die is cast," marked the point of no return for both himself and the Roman Republic. The civil war that followed was swift and decisive. Picture Caesar's veterans, hardened by years of fighting in Gaul, as they advanced through Italy with a speed that shocked their enemies. City after city opened its gates to Caesar, and within months he had become master of Rome itself. Pompey and his supporters fled to Greece, hoping to rebuild their strength and return to reclaim the Republic. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE was the decisive engagement of the Civil War. Picture the two armies facing each other across the plains of Thessaly, Romans prepared to fight Romans, in a conflict that would determine the future of their world. Caesar's veterans, outnumbered but experienced, broke Pompey's larger but less cohesive army. The battle lasted only a few hours, but its consequences would endure for centuries. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus made him the undisputed master of the Roman world, but it also marked the effective end of the Roman Republic. Picture Caesar as he pursued his enemies across the Mediterranean, defeating them in Africa and Spain, while establishing his authority throughout the empire. He pardoned his enemies, enacted reforms to address the social problems that had plagued Rome for decades, and began the process of transforming the Roman state into something new. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, was intended to restore the Roman Republic, but it had the opposite effect. Picture the scene in the Senate House as Caesar fell beneath the daggers of men he had considered friends. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, believed they were striking a blow for freedom, but they had killed the one man who might have guided Rome's transformation peacefully. The chaos that followed Caesar's death was worse than anything the Republic had experienced before. Picture the Roman people, shocked by the murder of their hero, as they listened to Mark Antony's funeral oration over Caesar's body. The consul's words inflamed the crowd, and soon the conspirators were fleeing for their lives as Rome erupted in violence and disorder. Into this chaos stepped Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son. Picture this young man, slight and sickly, as he claimed his inheritance and began the patient work of building a power base. Few could have imagined that this youth would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and would establish a dynasty that would rule for nearly a century. The second triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, was a far more brutal arrangement than the first. Picture the proscription lists being posted throughout Rome, naming hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens who were to be killed and their property confiscated. The triumvirs needed money to pay their armies and were willing to destroy the old aristocracy to get it. Among the victims was Cicero, the greatest orator of his age, whose head and hands were displayed in the forum as a warning to all who opposed the new order. The final act of the Republic's destruction played out in the East, where Mark Antony had allied himself with Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Picture their court in Alexandria, where Roman and Egyptian culture blended in a display of luxury and power that scandalized traditional Romans. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was both personal and political, an alliance that might have created a new kind of empire blending East and West. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the last great naval battle of the ancient world. Picture the war galleys facing each other in the waters off the western coast of Greece, their bronze rams gleaming in the morning sun. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the capable Agrippa, faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra in a battle that would determine whether Rome would be ruled from the west or the east. The battle was decided when Cleopatra's ships suddenly withdrew from the fight, taking Antony with them. Picture the confusion and demoralization that spread through their forces as their leaders fled the field. Octavian's victory was complete, and within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, leaving him as the sole ruler of the Roman world. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Octavian standing in the ruins of the old Republic, contemplating the task that lay before him. The Roman world was exhausted by a century of civil war, its institutions shattered, and its people yearning for peace. The young man who would become Augustus faced the challenge of creating a new form of government that could provide stability while preserving the illusion of republican tradition. The transformation from republic to empire was not the work of a single moment, but a gradual process that would unfold over the coming decades. Picture the Roman people, weary of conflict and uncertainty, as they began to accept the reality that their ancient liberties had been sacrificed for the promise of order and prosperity. The Republic had died, not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow erosion of institutions and traditions that had once seemed eternal. Let your breathing slow as you contemplate this pivotal moment in history, when the Roman world stood balanced between its past and its future. The men and women who had lived through this transformation sleep peacefully in their tombs, but their choices and sacrifices created the empire that would dominate the Western world for centuries to come. Tonight, as you join them in rest, their story prepares to enter its most glorious and enduring chapter. Part 4. The Empire's Golden Age and Eternal Legacy. 31 BCE, 476 CE. The dawn of the Roman Empire broke gently over the Seven Hills, as Augustus, no longer Octavian, but the first citizen of a transformed Rome, walked quietly through his simple house on the Palatine Hill. The year was 27 BCE, and the Roman world was about to enter its most remarkable period of peace and prosperity. Picture, if you will, this moment of quiet transformation. A young man who had inherited a world torn by civil war, now carefully crafting a new form of government that would endure for centuries, while appearing to restore the cherished traditions of the past. Augustus was a master of political theatre, understanding that Romans would accept autocracy only if it wore the mask of republicanism. Imagine him addressing the Senate, formally offering to restore the Republic and return all power to the people and their representatives. The senators, many of whom owed their positions to his favor, dutifully protested and begged him to continue his leadership. This careful dance allowed Augustus to accumulate unprecedented power while maintaining the fiction that he was merely the first among equals. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that Augustus established, would last for 2 centuries, an achievement unmatched in human history. Picture the transformation of the Roman world as the legions turned from conquest to consolidation, from destruction to construction. The same soldiers who had fought in the civil wars now built roads and aqueducts, bridges and theatres, spreading Roman civilization from the Scottish Highlands to the sands of the Sahara. Under Augustus, Rome itself was transformed from a city of brick into a city of marble. Picture the massive building projects that reshaped the urban landscape. The Forum of Augustus, with its temple to Mars the Avenger, the Theatre of Marcellus, where citizens could enjoy the plays of Plautus and Terence, and the Mausoleum of Augustus, where the emperor himself would one day rest. The city became a showcase of imperial power, its monuments declaring to the world that Rome was eternal and its dominion would never end. The cultural flowering that occurred under Augustus was as remarkable as his political achievements. Picture the great poets of the age, Virgil crafting the Aeneid, the epic that would give Romans their national mythology, Horace writing lyrics that captured the spirit of the new age, Ovid spinning tales of love and transformation that would enchant readers for millennia. Literature flourished under imperial patronage, creating works that would become the foundation of Western education and culture. Augustus's domestic policies were as carefully crafted as his foreign conquests. Picture the marriage laws he enacted, encouraging Roman citizens to marry and have children while restricting the rights of bachelors and the childless. The emperor understood that empire required not just military might, but demographic strength, and he worked to ensure that Roman families would continue to populate the territories that Roman armies had conquered. The imperial succession was always Augustus's greatest challenge. Picture the aging emperor, weighing the qualities of potential heirs while struggling with the fundamental contradiction of his position, how to pass on power in a system that officially denied that such power existed. His stepson Tiberius, reluctant and melancholy, would eventually inherit the purple, but not before a series of family tragedies that would haunt the imperial house for generations. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind a world transformed beyond recognition. Picture his funeral procession, winding through the streets of Rome as citizens lined the route to pay their respects to the man who had given them peace. The Senate officially declared him a god, and temples were built in his honor throughout the empire. The transformation from mortal ruler to divine figure reflected the new reality of imperial power. The emperor was no longer merely a man, but the living embodiment of Rome itself. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, ruled for 23 years from his island retreat on Capri. Picture the lonely emperor surrounded by the blue waters of the Mediterranean, governing the world through letters and messengers while avoiding the political intrigues of the capital. His reign was marked by financial prudence and military restraint, qualities that made him an effective ruler, but an unpopular one. The Romans, accustomed to the pageantry of Augustus, found Tiberius's austere style disappointing. The madness of Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius in 37 CE, provided a stark contrast to his predecessor's restraint. Picture the young emperor, handsome and charming, as he began his reign with acts of generosity and reform that delighted the Roman people. But power and perhaps mental illness gradually transformed him into a tyrant who believed in his own divinity and demanded worship from his subjects. His assassination, after less than 4 years of rule, demonstrated that even imperial power had its limits. Claudius, who became emperor after Caligula's murder, was an unlikely ruler who proved to be one of Rome's most capable administrators. Picture the scholarly emperor, stuttering and limping, as he supervised the conquest of Britain and the construction of new harbors and aqueducts. His reign marked the continued expansion of Roman citizenship and the integration of provincial elites into the imperial administration. Under Claudius, the empire became truly cosmopolitan, with talented individuals from across the Mediterranean world serving in positions of authority. The year 64 CE brought disaster to Rome when a great fire swept through the city, destroying much of the urban center and leaving thousands homeless. Picture the flames leaping from building to building, fed by the summer heat and the wooden construction that still characterized much of the city. The Emperor Nero, who had succeeded Claudius, was accused of starting the fire to clear land for his Golden House, though he actually organized relief efforts and opened his own palaces to house the displaced. Nero's persecution of the Christians, whom he blamed for the fire, marked the beginning of a conflict that would ultimately transform the empire. Picture the early Christian community in Rome, small and secretive, as they faced the first systematic persecution by the imperial government. The apostles Peter and Paul are said to have died during this persecution, their martyrdom helping to establish Rome as the center of the Christian world. The civil war that followed Nero's suicide in 68 CE, the year of the 4 emperors, threatened to return Rome to the chaos of the late Republic. Picture the legions marching on Rome, each supporting their own candidate for the purple, while the capital trembled with the fear that the empire might fragment into competing kingdoms. The victory of Vespasian, a general from the Jewish war, restored stability and established the Flavian dynasty. Under the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, Rome reached new heights of power and prosperity. Picture the construction of the Colosseum, the greatest amphitheater ever built, where gladiators fought and died for the entertainment of 50,000 spectators. The building's innovative design, with its complex system of elevators and trap doors, its sophisticated drainage and crowd control systems, represented the pinnacle of Roman engineering achievement. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE celebrated in the Arch of Titus that still stands in the Roman Forum, marked the end of Jewish independence and the beginning of the diaspora that would scatter the Jewish people across the Mediterranean world. Picture the Roman legions as they breached the walls of the Holy City, their victory bringing to Rome the treasures of the temple and thousands of Jewish captives who would be sold into slavery. The reign of Trajan, who became emperor in 98 CE, marked the height of Roman territorial expansion. Picture the emperor leading his legions across the Danube into Dacia, the gold-rich kingdom that would fund his massive building projects. The Victory Column that bears his name, with its spiral frieze depicting the Dacian Wars, still stands in Rome as a testament to his military genius and artistic vision. Trajan's conquest of Mesopotamia briefly gave Rome control of territories that reached to the Persian Gulf, making the empire larger than it had ever been or would ever be again. Picture Roman soldiers standing on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, the same rivers that had witnessed the rise and fall of Babylon and Assyria. For a brief moment, it seemed that Rome might truly become the master of the entire known world. But Trajan's eastern conquests proved impossible to hold, and his successor Hadrian adopted a policy of consolidation rather than expansion. Picture the emperor traveling throughout his domains, inspecting fortifications and meeting with local officials, his keen mind always seeking ways to improve the administration of the vast territories under his control. Hadrian's Wall, built across northern Britain to keep out the Pictish tribes, became the most famous symbol of Roman defensive architecture. Hadrian was perhaps the most cultured of the Roman emperors, a poet and architect who rebuilt the Pantheon and founded the city of Antinopolis in Egypt. Picture him in his villa at Tivoli, surrounded by replicas of the greatest monuments of the ancient world, a private paradise where he could contemplate the achievements of human civilization. His reign marked the apex of Roman confidence and creativity, a time when it seemed that Roman rule would indeed be eternal. The Antonine Plague that swept through the empire in the 160s CE marked the beginning of Rome's long decline. Picture the disease, probably smallpox, as it spread along the trade routes that connected the Roman world, killing millions and disrupting the economic prosperity that had sustained the empire for 2 centuries. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and warrior, spent his final years fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube while composing his meditations, reflections on duty and mortality that would inspire readers for millennia. The crisis of the 3rd century brought the empire to the brink of collapse. Picture the rapid succession of emperors, most of whom died violent deaths after reigns measured in months rather than years. The empire fragmented into competing kingdoms. Barbarian invasions devastated the frontiers, and economic collapse brought hyperinflation and urban decline. For a time, it seemed that the Roman world would follow the path of so many previous civilizations and disappear into the darkness of history. But Rome's genius for adaptation and renewal saved the empire from complete destruction. Picture Diocletian, the emperor who restored order through radical reforms, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, and establishing a new system of government that would endure for centuries. His persecutions of Christians represented the old order's last attempt to maintain traditional Roman religion, but the tide of history was turning toward a new faith. The conversion of Constantine in 312 CE transformed both Christianity and the Roman Empire. Picture the emperor standing before the walls of Rome, preparing for the battle that would make him master of the Western Empire, when he saw a vision of the cross and the words, "In this sign, conquer." His victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge was attributed to the Christian God, and Christianity began its transformation from a persecuted minority to the official religion of the empire. Constantine's new capital at Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, represented the empire's shift eastward. Picture the dedication ceremony in 330 CE, as the emperor consecrated his new city to the Christian God and established it as the new Rome that would carry on Roman traditions for another 1,000 years. The city's location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made it a natural center for trade and administration, while its massive fortifications made it nearly impregnable. The division of the empire into western and eastern halves became permanent after the death of Theodosius V in 395 CE. Picture the two imperial courts in Rome and Constantinople as they struggled to maintain Roman unity while facing increasingly different challenges. The Western Empire bore the brunt of barbarian invasions, while the Eastern Empire faced threats from Persia and the emerging power of Islam. The sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigoths in 410 CE shocked the ancient world and marked the beginning of the end for the Western Empire. Picture the barbarian warriors walking through the streets of the Eternal City, their torches illuminating monuments that had stood for centuries. The psychological impact of Rome's fall was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction, as people throughout the empire began to question whether Roman rule was indeed eternal. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a barbarian king. Picture this final moment of the Western Empire, not marked by a great battle or dramatic siege, but by the quiet abdication of a boy emperor whose name ironically combined those of Rome's founder and its greatest ruler. Yet, even as the Western Empire fell, the Eastern Empire continued to flourish. Picture Justinian and Theodora in the 6th century as they reconquered much of the Western Mediterranean and codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis that would influence legal systems for centuries. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, maintained Roman traditions and identity until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. The legacy of Rome extends far beyond its political boundaries or chronological limits. Picture the Roman roads that still carry traffic, the aqueducts that still supply water, the legal principles that still govern modern societies. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages that hundreds of millions speak today, while Roman literature and philosophy continue to be studied and appreciated. Roman architectural principles influenced the design of government buildings, churches, and monuments throughout the Western world. Picture the United States Capitol with its dome inspired by Roman models, or the countless courthouse facades that echo the temples of ancient Rome. The very concept of republican government, with its checks and balances and its emphasis on the rule of law, draws heavily on Roman precedents. The Roman Empire's integration of diverse peoples and cultures created a template for later attempts at universal governance. Picture the Roman citizen, whether born in Spain or Syria, Britain or Egypt, enjoying the same legal rights and participating in the same cultural traditions. This vision of unity in diversity would inspire later empires and international organizations, from the Holy Roman Empire to the European Union. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the Roman world at its height. A vast network of cities connected by roads and aqueducts, where a merchant from Gaul could do business in Alexandria, where a philosopher from Athens could teach in Rome, where a soldier from Britain could serve on the Rhine. This was humanity's first truly global civilization, an achievement that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. The Romans who built this empire sleep peacefully in their tombs, but their legacy lives on in our laws and languages, our buildings and our books, our very conception of what civilization means. They gave us the idea that diverse peoples could live together under a single system of law, that individual merit could triumph over the accident of birth, that human reason could create institutions that would endure for centuries. Tonight, as you join them in rest, remember that their story is also our story, their achievements part of our common human heritage. The empire they built with bronze and marble, with law and legion, continues to shape our world in ways both visible and invisible. In the rhythm of your breathing, in the peace of your sleep, you carry forward the eternal legacy of Rome, ensuring that their dream of civilization will never truly die. Let the gentle darkness carry you back through the centuries, past the rise and fall of empires, past the glory and tragedy of human ambition, to a place of peace where all the struggles of history resolve into the quiet satisfaction of a story well told. The Roman Empire, in all its complexity and contradiction, its triumph and its tragedy, now lives on in the realm of memory and dream, where its greatest victories are forever preserved and its noblest ideals continue to inspire. Sleep well, and let the echoes of ancient Rome sing you gently into dreams.